Welcome and good evening. I'm Fiona Reynolds, and you know from the programme that our two speakers, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, Mark Lloyd and Helen Wakeham, and we're delighted to be here to this event hosted by the University of Bath's Institute for Policy Research. So we're going to discuss how to address England's water quality. What can we do? And there could scarcely be a more important time to do it. The uproar, the complete public debate, and that's putting it kindly, about the huge public concern around water quality, but also around storm overflows, around the whole questions about lack of investments as people see it in water infrastructure. We're still in the middle of the spending round, PR24, which was supposed to be over by now, but with 6 companies, including Wessex here, appealing to the CMA, and I think 5 have now been officially referred, not Thames. Thames is a special case, as I'm sure you all know. And a major review of the whole regulatory system for water, commissioned from Sir John Cunliffe, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. So there's a lot going on, and you might think this is a bad time to be discussing water. Actually, it's a brilliant time because everything is up for grabs, the whole system, the whole debate. And the government wants public views, wants solutions, and we're going to discuss, I think, tonight what some of those solutions might be. So 2 brilliant speakers who will each open with a 5-minute short presentation before I've then got a couple of questions, and then we'll open it to you. So get your questions ready, because this whole event depends on... I can see we've got some. Good. All right. We're not going to be short of questions. That's a relief. Good. So let me very briefly introduce our speakers. So Mark Lloyd is Chief Executive of the Rivers Trust and has been since 2019. Previously CEO of the Angling Trust and Fish Legal. Previously CEO of Thames 21, which is one of Rivers Trust's members. He's been passionate about water quality for as long as he's been active in this in the world of work, so I know we're going to get from him. And of course it's his, actually I think it's Helen's statistics, beautifully presented by Mark and the Rivers Trust, about the state and the health of our rivers. And then Helen Wakeham, who's Director of Water at the Environment Agency. What a job. You must have spent the last couple of years having a very interesting time. Helen tells me she's just worked for the EA and in related roles for 30 years on environmental policy and management, things like incident management, agriculture, land management policy, flood risk, the list goes on. And Helen's passion, I think, is being in, on, or indeed under water in your recreational time. So we've got 2 amazing contributors, and I'll go straight on to Mark. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So, yes, as you just heard, I've been involved in river conservation all my life, and I'm getting on. So, got a lot of experience in this area, and passionate about rivers. I've always been passionate about rivers since I was about 7 years old and playing in my local river. But we're here to talk about water quality, and I think, you know, given all the news about sewage, it would be easy to think that that water company pollution is the only issue. But actually, of course, many of you will know that the true story is it's much, much more complex than that. And really, river health is a kind of wicked problem. I heard it likened to knife crime and hospital waiting lists as a sort of really complex issue. And that's, I think, mainly because you're dealing with a natural ecosystem with many different features to it. But on the water quality complexity, I think agriculture is actually the biggest polluter, so a lot of runoff of soil and pesticides and animal waste going into the river. But also highways are becoming more and more of a problem. The more cars we have, the more complex chemicals we have around in society. Mine water remains a big problem. And then you've got other things like flea and tick treatments on pets, which are getting ever more toxic and effective at killing fleas and ticks, but they're also very, very effective at killing invertebrates in rivers. And the list goes on. I mean, there are a huge number of things which are all dribbling and pouring into our rivers from many, many different sources, and many of which are just not monitored at all. There are lots of chemicals we don't even measure in any scale at all. But of course, it's more complex than that, again, because water quality is entirely interrelated with quantity and habitat. So people say dilution is the solution to pollution, which it isn't in many cases. But certainly the more water you have, the more resilient a river can be to pollution going into it. And there are some really complex ecological interactions. So the big floods that we had on the River Wye ripped out lots of the ranunculus in the river, which is that long flowing green weed you see in lots of rivers. And on ranunculus lives a black fly larvae, which actually takes phosphate out of the river. Because the ranunculus wasn't there, the habitat for the black fly larvae was gone, so the phosphate levels, which are already high from chicken farms and other sources, then the phosphate levels went up further, and you got these awful algal blooms, which were also brought on by low flows and high temperatures. So there are these really interesting interactions. The other thing is sort of river morphology. You have weirs in rivers which impound long sections of river upstream, and that means you don't get the lovely pool-riffle sequence that you should have in rivers. And rivers are straightened, and so they don't have as many bends, which is where you get the riffles and pools. And each of those riffles is really a sort of mini sewage treatment works but in the natural form. So all the water gets drawn through the gravel, and bacteria kind of work their magic. So if you lose that and you have a long impounded section, water pollution in the top is exactly the same as pollution coming out the bottom, rather than being processed. So, and of course, water quality isn't the only huge challenge we face. You know, we've got a climate emergency, a biodiversity emergency. And so as we're looking to solutions, I think we don't need to just think about improving our sewer infrastructure. We definitely need to invest more in sewage treatment and a lot more in maintenance as well, because maintenance is often underfunded. But we need to address all of these sources, and we also need to build resilience by improving the natural functions of our rivers and their catchments. So slowing the flow of water, allowing time for nature to purify it, allowing time for it to sink into the ground and come out and sustain rivers in summer with nice, cool, clean water. And that means putting in things like re-meandering rivers, putting in buffer strips, restoring natural flows, having healthy soils is probably the single best thing we could do for the environment, trees and wetlands. And so these nature-based solutions, I think, alongside improvement in new works and better maintenance, could not only help water quality, but they'd also contribute to net zero. They'd improve nature. They'd reduce the need for sewer overflows because the flow would be slowed. They reduce flooding, and they keep rivers flowing in hot, dry summers. So as Fiona said, you know, we've got this amazing opportunity with the Cunliffe Commission, I think, to sort of think differently, to think of rivers as systems rather than thinking them as a series of inputs that need to be managed individually.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Helen?
It's great going second, isn't it? Because I've been, well, Mark's
Yes,
been
I could see you scribbling.
Mark said that. I said that. So yeah, I mean, first thing, I've had a lot of different jobs in my career. I've worked quite widely in the Environment Agency. I've also had jobs in plating shops and factories and things like that. I've never quite had a job where so many people have gone, oh, what is that like? Why did you say you'd do that? It's a brilliant time to be talking about water. I've spent most of my career in and around it in various guises. We've got an absolutely unprecedented opportunity here because for most of my career water has been niche, and I'm looking at some of the people around the room that I know who might have been talking about water with not many people listening, and now everybody is talking about water. It's given us an unprecedented opportunity, as you say, Fiona, to look at the whole system. And I often start when I talk about water to talk a little bit about history. And I think the history of water quality in England is really quite interesting. Since the Industrial Revolution, it's been one of apprentices in London complaining because they had to eat salmon every day, through to quite sudden declines in water quality with the introduction of the water closet, which was a good idea from a public health perspective, but maybe not. Outcry, poor water quality, investment not particularly well thought through, and the consequences of that investment leading to perhaps a temporary improvement and then more decline. And we've been through these cycles over and over again, right up into the 1980s with privatisation, and sort of moving into that privatised period. Actually, that first 15 or so years of privatisation drove unbelievable improvements in water quality. When I started my career, we literally were wading around in raw sewage everywhere. In the inland streams in Lancashire, where I come from, as you might be able to guess, I took the first set of bathing water samples at Blackpool. There was raw sewage all over the beach, not because of an incident or something going wrong, but all day, every day, and it was pretty much normalised for everybody. So when people say our water's in a worse state than it's ever been, frankly, it is not borne out by the facts. And there's some really good things that have come from water industry investment. So phosphorus from wastewater is down 80% in the last 25 years. 25 years. How was that done? Well, better investment in treatment at sewage works, but also source control. We took phosphorus out of detergents about a decade ago. We made it illegal to have phosphorus in our detergents. When you look at the graphs of what happened to phosphorus in wastewater, it comes down before that. And it comes down before that was because manufacturers, in response to a regulatory signal, started taking phosphorus out of detergents early. And it's had a really profound effect on water quality. And you can look at a set of graphs that show that phosphorus and ammonia as well actually coming out of wastewater. And you can see phosphorus and ammonia coming out of our lowland river system. So you can see in the lowlands that polluting load coming down. So it tells us that when we get investment right, it really works. But we're getting to the end of, there's two things going on. We're getting to the end of what conventional wastewater treatment can do. So we're going to make a huge investment in the next 5 years. We'll be treating phosphorus to what's technically achievable. What do you do then? All those improvements. If we keep doing what we've always done, the improvement that we get is already starting to tail off. And we've seen huge improvements in river ecology. They're starting to tail off. So we need to think about it and do something different. And as Mark says, wastewater is no longer the biggest issue. Farming contributes more. Transport in urban areas, 18% of the problem. That's twice what storm overflows are causing, with a tiny investment. So in the next 5 years, we'll invest 10 billion in storm overflow treatment, and we'll invest 150 million in our transport systems. That's 1.5%. For an equivalent problem. So I think where we've got a huge opportunity, we've also got a risk here, because everybody is so interested in end of pipe and so interested in the water industry that we're not having a big enough and a broad enough debate about all the influences on our water quality and quantity. And Mark's right, the single biggest influence on, the single thing that's presenting the biggest, sorry, it's been a really long day, I'm really sorry everyone. The single biggest influence on our water is morphology. So our river systems are not in a natural state, and in some cases that kind of makes a lot of sense, because downtown Bath would look very different if we naturalised the Avon in downtown Bath. But it does tell you that there's an awful lot more to water quality than what the water industry is doing.
You two are amazing. I mean, both of you are entirely sort of complementary, but you've just opened our eyes, I think, to so many different aspects. And I mean, my first question, I used, scribbling down, the word that occurred to me was wicked. These are genuinely complex, interrelated problems. And, at one level, you and I've been involved with policy making in so many people look at wicked issues and actually don't know where to start. So my question to you is, what do you think's really at the heart of this? You talked about river morphology, both of you, but actually is that where you'd start? I mean, what do you think is absolute core reason why we've got this mega complex challenge at the moment? Who wants to go first?
Shall I go
Yes,
first
you
this
go
time?
first, yeah.
Why have we got the challenge? I think to a large extent, water, both in the context of the water industry and in terms of the environment, is the way of describing it, which is silent service.
Yeah.
Everybody expects it, and when it's there, nobody is really that interested.
Yeah.
It's only those moments, COVID, when everybody's out looking at the local environment, a drought when all of a sudden there might be a risk that you turn your tap on, or the storm overflow scandal. You just get these moments where all of a sudden it's not silent.
Yeah.
And I think we've been in a silent situation. Our drinking water quality is excellent. It's some of the best drinking water in the world. It always comes out of the tap when you turn it on. We have this conception of ourselves as a society that laughs in the rain. It's the story we tell ourselves. It's very deep in the psyche, and so I think we're here because we haven't thought about it enough. It's been somebody else's problem or not a problem at all.
Taken for granted.
And just taken for granted, which is why I say, despite really the noise about water and in some ways being very negative, it's a real opportunity because people are talking about it.
What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And I think the other thing is that we have tended to deal with problems one by one and to try and tackle them individually. And our response, usually, when there's a problem, is to write a plan. And often there isn't any money to implement that plan. So we are awash with plans in all our catchments. You have, diffuse water pollution plans, your drought plans, flood plans. And often they are not joined up, and they might actually be saying that we need to do quite different things. And we're not looking for the intersection between all those things and thinking how could we do something which benefited all of them, and we could and then pooling resources. So there's an inadequate budget for dealing with each of those things. That budget is unlikely to get bigger in the current state of public finances. So we need to get a lot smarter about how we spend our money, and to think about, what's the most benefit I can get from this pound? How, what's the maximum number of kilograms of phosphate I could take out of this river for this pound, and then spend it that way, rather than spending it in these sort of boxes, which, as Helen said, some of them are disproportionately. There's a lot of money in some of the boxes and hardly anything in other boxes.
And some of that's not very objective. The money is there because the noise has been huge or whatever.
Yes.
No, so you made a powerful point about joining up. Okay, so I'm going to turn the whole picture around now and say you're Sir John Cunliffe, okay? And he's not been asked to address the sort of our relationship with water, which might have been a good starting point actually. But what's and let's go into huge detail, but just what do you think is going to be at the top of his mind, and what's the best sort of thing he can do to set the right tone for the future? You go first this time.
Well, I think when it started, it was very much going to look at the water industry, as in water companies, and we put quite a lot of pressure on for it to think broader in this more holistic way. And I think the thing that I'm most excited about that he seems to be thinking about, he seems to be engaging about, is to sort of look at the whole water governance system. So in order to get this joined upness, you really need to kind of work much more at a local level to identify what the pressures are really much more precisely, and also what the opportunities are for delivering in this collaborative way.
Okay.
And then from that local level, having regional bodies which then bring together, say 8 or 10 local plans which have been developed with a bit more money, because we have catchment partnerships at the moment, but they're kind of very underfunded. And then at the regional level, bringing together lots of sources of funding like flood budgets and water company expenditure and various other things, biodiversity, net gain and things, and then thinking, okay, we've got this pot of money, how could we spend this to deliver multiple outcomes in an integrated way, which would be quite radical, and it would mean quite a lot of reorganising of existing bodies, but I think you know, a lot of the, you know, if you look at the OECD guidance on water governance, it always says manage water at the most local level possible, and the best unit to manage water is a catchment.
Yeah.
It's the only logical. We should actually realign all our administrative boundaries around water catchments. If I was king.
Angela Rayner might have something to say about that. But yeah. Brilliant. What about you?
Yeah,
you're John Cunliffe now.
Yeah, I remember Baroness Barbara Young, who used to be the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency. I remember her waving her arms around and talking about moving administrative boundaries to catchments. It didn't play very well, but she continued to be very vigorous about it.
Yeah.
So I think all of that is true, and I think there's something not just about involving that sort of catchment style thinking, but actually properly involving local people in decision making, which creates the skin in the game, because we can rearrange the deck chairs with our institutions or even with our plans as much as we like. If there isn't actually a mechanism for delivering those plans, we fail. You know, and the reason why there's been this massive reduction in pollution from the water industry has been because there is a planning mechanism and an investment mechanism and a regulatory mechanism to make it happen. And it's imperfect, and I'm not here to argue that it's perfect, but you can see where the investment's gone and what it's achieved for the environment. Those things don't exist for agriculture. There isn't a way of funding those things. It sort of exists for transport, but it's not the priority. So we could do a lot more. We could put a lot of effort into planning, but it doesn't matter how beautiful and how granular the plan is, if there isn't a lever to enable the measures in the plan to be delivered, it won't work. So I think there's something there. And for me, the thing that will make it hang together is vision, and what are we trying to achieve for our water environment, and are all government departments, all institutions signed up to the same vision and then the same plan? Because at the moment they tend to be at odds. We've got arm's length bodies with different remits, we've got different views. The Environment Agency has a sustainability remit, Natural England doesn't. Ofwat's got a responsibility for price control of the environment. You know, all of these things don't add up. So what are we actually trying to achieve? And if you can agree that and you can set that vision from government, you've then got half a chance of the institutions that are trying to deliver it all pulling in the same direction.
Great. Now, I'm going to go to the audience in a minute. So Amy's going to come to you, but my last question is really, again, turning the telescope round. Lots of stuff we all take up. The government needs to do X, water companies need to do Y. What about the role of citizens? What could we do, and what's the most important thing we can do to make our contribution to a more sustainable water system?
Lots. I think citizens having a voice is really important, and citizens having a view. The noise around storm overflows has been overwhelming, and it's driven some interesting debates and some investment. You know, people have got views about that. But citizens actually having an opinion is hugely important, and we need to keep that interest there. So what is it that we actually want? And I think all the debates about that vision for water, and what I think, putting myself back in Sir John Cunliffe's shoes, he's not going to fix everything. He's going to have a lot to say about the water sector, and then I think he's going to make recommendations about a further conversation, and that conversation's got to involve people. And I think I did an interesting debate. I was at something in the House of Lords this morning about water, and people saying, well, water customers are very interested in investing forward, so they're quite happy to pay for things which will not be realised in their lifetime. They'll like that. They're not very happy to pay for investment in other sectors if the polluter isn't the water. They're not very interested in that. And I said, well, that's okay up to a point, but actually an economist might see it like that, but a water customer is also somebody who consumes food and is also a citizen, and has also got... So I think there's citizens being involved in a different kind of debate about collectively what we want to pay for and by what route we'll pay for it is important. And finally, one thing that has just changed so dramatically in the last 10 years is citizen science.
Oh,
Citizen science. Citizen science.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about women as well.
Yeah.
But citizen science, and I think everybody's interested in how much monitoring gets done, who does it, who pays for it, how you do it. There really is that for me there's a real gap in how we monitor, which is we can do some monitoring which will give us an overview of what's going on water quality in England, but there just is no substitute for people going out and looking, whether they're being citizen scientists and seeing themselves as such or going out and reporting things. And that it's that, you know, back to what you said, Mark, it's that sort of ultra local. You cannot get that level of intelligence from anywhere else, and we're setting up systems so we can receive it, but we absolutely need people to go and do the work.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree entirely on citizen science. We've been doing a big project over the last few years in 8 demonstration catchments, looking at how you can bring together citizen science data with kind of official data. And, you know, we really do not have enough data on our rivers. But that it does need to be in a framework. There is a lot of citizen science going on, which doesn't have a sort of a clear purpose, and there's no one receiving that data and acting on it. So we do need to build a proper framework around that, so that, you know, people spending their time doing that it leads to something, and that data is used. And we found some really interesting ways of doing that. I think, I mean, the other thing citizens can do, I think, is take action at home, so storing water, and that can reduce enormously the pressure on CSOs, trying to hold rain where it lands, and managing chemicals in the home. I think a lot of people will just use paint or you know, sort of white spirit or something. They'll just get rid of it down the drain and think, well, it's gone. And also, of course, all the unflushables that we have. Enormous number of sewage blockages are caused by fats, oils and greases, and you know, unflushable stuff being flushed. Get involved in the catchment partnership. Come and have your say. Come and say what's important to your river, and then go away and tell other people what's going on and how they can get involved. And then I think, you know, Helen's right, that sort of activism and advocacy. Writing to your MP is really powerful, and MPs really do pay attention to what's in their postbag.
Great. Well, we've started off with some great ideas. Now, who's first? Here we go. And please say who you are and if you have an affiliation, just to help us.
Okay. Hi. I'm Jenny. I have no affiliation, except I'm going to confess, because I'm hoping that other people will confess. I'm a vet. I completely agree with you. We shouldn't be using pesticides as preventables. But I work for a corporate. I have no say. I've written to them. We kind of need someone higher up to say no. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted is, could you use your budget to educate people so that we can share that responsibility? Because I think the majority of people have no idea sewage treatment is just about let it settle, maybe some bacteria, done. That's it. You know, I think we need to say we cannot remove that drug you're drinking, drug you're taking. We cannot remove the spirit that goes down there. It will keep coming back to you. I don't think people know that. I really don't. And, you know, I think that would be a very cheap thing to do. I don't think people know that if they buy organic, then the pesticides won't go in the water and the sewage can't remove the pesticides. I just don't think people know.
Yeah.
And I think if they knew, it would be like plastic bags. It's like, oh, I shouldn't do that. And it becomes uncool. But it would involve the government fessing up to, oh, the water's not as clean as you think. And that's tricky. And I guess that's why I'm saying, as a vet, I shouldn't be preventatively prescribing pesticides. But I am under pressure from above to do that.
Really interesting point. Mark?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm a geographer, and so is Helen. And what? Great, brilliant. Yeah. I mean, best subjects in the world. But you know, non-geographers, all they know about geography is Oxbow Lake and the water cycle.
They are the best bits.
They are good. Yeah, Oxbow Lakes are cool. But but we don't really understand the water cycle, and the water cycle as it happens through our system. And I think you're absolutely right. I think opening people's eyes to what actually happens beyond the U-bend is really, really important, and we need to find kind of interesting ways to do that.
Helen.
Yeah, I agree with you, and the exciting times on sewage in the last few years have most certainly, part of the cause of that has been a reluctance to talk about sewage at all. So how do you have that conversation? And now it's all out there. It's very, very difficult, having created a bogeyman, if you like, in the water industry, which is, it's a generalisation, but it makes it easy for everybody to go in. Oh, I'm going to point over there. Sorry, I can see where Wessex Water is sitting, so I'm not going to point and that makes that conversation all the harder. So I agree with you, but I think it's going to be quite interesting to work out what mechanisms you use to keep that societal conversation going. And we started. We ran an event at the end of January, which was not the Environment Agency telling people what this vision for water ought to be, but was actually let's get people who don't normally talk about water in a room and see how interested they are in forming a view about how you co-create a vision for society. It's called Water 2100. We just started it, and it'll feed into Cunliffe, but we're talking to House Builders Federation, Women's Institute, people who wouldn't normally be out talking about water. And I think that's what it will take. It'll take that sort of multi-pronged approach from people who you wouldn't necessarily expect to be at the forefront of the conversation. And I will have another think about vet meds and different routes in, because I think it's a real issue.
But actually, in some of these areas, I mean, the government could just ban them. They could ban wet wipes that don't degrade. I mean, I know we've got a commitment, and it's taken how many years to get a commitment for that? I mean, it's such an obvious thing. And I think people are increasingly a bit fed up with there not being clarity about what's acceptable and what's not, and with some of these chemicals, PFAS and all the rest of it.
But then it's more difficult than you think. So one of my favourite slides, and I always apologise because my poor person now, I said I want a picture of a dog in a raincoat drinking a cup of coffee. Okay. And she's just like, why do you want a picture of a dog in a raincoat? Yeah. So I went out at a conference before Christmas with a picture of a French bulldog in a raincoat drinking a cup of coffee, and I put it there to say, well, actually, if you think about all the problems we're talking about with water, they're entirely societal. So everybody's got these pets who are having preventative treatments. They're all they're taking the pet for a walk wearing a raincoat or a dry robe, which is not the brand, but that's got PFAS in it. When they get home after the cold walk, they're frying an egg with a frying pan that's got PFAS in it, and they have a big steaming cup of coffee. So there's some things you can say. Why wouldn't you ban non-essential use of PFAS? Why wouldn't you step away from preventive use of vet meds? But when I said this morning, actually, brilliant citizen science project, Water Blitz that Earthwatch run. Their first result in autumn was much more caffeine everywhere than we've ever seen before. So how you start to get into real fundamentals of everybody's drink. You might be able to cut down on your pharmaceutical use, but are you going to drink less coffee?
Right, next question. Here's the lady here, and then we'll go to the back. Yeah, who's in black? Wave and...
Thank you. So I'm Zoe Hancock, and I'm currently working at Bath and North East Somerset Council. But I've previously worked for Wessex Water, managing the catchment partnerships for 10 years. So I do come with some knowledge. But one of my questions was around growth and housing growth with the new government coming in, and the opportunities with the Cunliffe Review, because I think the amount of growth that is coming, especially in our area, the opportunity to deliver SUDs, sustainable urban drainage systems, and have a more regulated picture so that developers who are putting development in are doing sustainable growth. And I think that will help with water quality, but will also help with slowing the flow and making sure water isn't there. And at the minute, based in the council, trying to balance a huge amount of different agendas, I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts about how do we actually deliver that in a sustainable way?
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge challenge. We've got climate change makes everything worse because we get more intense rain and then less rain and higher temperatures. But then if you overlay building 1.5 million homes on top of that, it then makes everything worse as well because you're just adding to the load all the infrastructure associated with that. The construction causes a huge amount of runoff. Often development sites are awful pollution sites. I called one in and it was prosecuted and they got fined 400,000. But you see them all over the country with sediment pouring off when they're building in the winter. And as you say, they are adding to this problem. So I would really like to see them have very high sustainability standards as standard. So if you make that a requirement of all new homes, then they've.
Do you mean grey water separation
I mean,
as well?
yeah. I mean, whatever they can do to store more water from the property itself. Just to build that in as a standard feature. And yes, it will be expensive initially, but as you've seen with lots of technologies like that, with solar panels, they're a tenth of the price that they were before, because people get better and better at doing these things because they become more innovative. So I think there's a real opportunity to build green. I don't think we're going to take it. The government has danced around, bringing in Schedule 3, I'm sure you're going to have the flood and, what's it called? The flood.
Schedule 3 of the Floods and Water Act.
Floods and Water Act, yeah, that's what I was going to say. But, and that would put a requirement for SUDs on all new developments, and they haven't done it for years, and repeated governments have kicked that down the road.
Helen, what about you?
I agree with Mark. I think any proposal which looks like it's going to slow housing development or make it cost more will be very difficult to land in the current environment. But that's not to say that there aren't things which can be done which will be hugely positive. So, for example, I think we were talking about it earlier, Matt, big developers do tend to go for sustainable drainage. There's advantages for them in doing that in terms of cost. It also, we know that if you've got water features in your development, it actually raises the value of the properties that are sold. So I think there's reasons why people do that. I think smart metering is something that, again, there's been a lot of dancing around smart metering. Does everybody have a smart water meter, for example? I think now is the time to push for it because it won't slow up anybody's housing. It will save us quite a lot of water, and you might have heard about lots of new shiny schemes and reservoirs and water transfer schemes in the next 25 years to fill this huge gap we've got in terms of our water supply. That's dwarfed by the amount of demand management we need to do if we're going to protect our water supplies and our environment for the future. All of that requires us getting demand down, so I think universal smart metering is a win-win-win-win for everybody, and it's an equity issue because at the moment, frankly, more poor people have water meters than affluent people. So I think there's a really strong argument for that. And then just growth more broadly is driving some really interesting conversations. So the Environment Agency has objected to housing developments in a number of places, notably in Oxford and Cambridge. And objecting to housing in Cambridge because there wasn't enough water drove a very quick and a very effective and a very helpful conversation about how you manage demand in the region, and has essentially created a new market, a water credit scheme, which will mean that there will be water in the right places. Without the push for growth and without the political pressure, I think that conversation would have taken a longer time to happen. And framing the environment, not just water, but the environment and nature, as actually a prerequisite for growth and something which brings capacity and resilience for growth is quite an interesting way to go, and it's an argument that seems to be holding quite a lot of sway. So I'm not Pollyanna. I think there's real challenges around growth and environment, but I think there is also some opportunity to make the case for natural capital.
So is there a sort of geography issue here, like where to put the new housing? Because, I mean, with the land use framework coming, I don't know if anybody is sort of aware of that, you know, because a lot of the problems we've got with housing being put in the wrong places, either on floodplains or in flood risk areas, and you know, the whole issue around nitrates and, you know, there just seems to be an opportunity as well to try and get development in the right place as well as the right kind of development. I don't know whether you're thinking about that in as well. I'm sure the Environment Agency is, but that consultation's only just begun, so it's another bit of a jigsaw. Now, there's a gentleman over there. Amy, you can pass it along. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Jan Hofman, Director of the Water Innovation and Research Center here at the university. What I miss a bit in the discussion, first of all, I think it's very good that there is activity and that there is an opportunity to improve water quality. But what I miss a bit in the discussion is this, let's say, more positive, ambitious level where you want to go to. And for instance, if I remember what was done in the River Rhine in Europe, for instance, it was a dead river in the 1970s, and they set up an incentive to return salmon in the river. And so what would be the appealing thing you would envision to strive for if you go for improvement of water quality?
I can't believe that Mark hasn't got a really clear sense of what a healthy river looks like. What should be the goal?
Well, I mean, we've had this standard of good ecological status as set by the Water Framework Directive, and we have made no progress on that. I remember launching something called the Blueprint for Water about 15, 20 years ago to try and because we could see that it was an issue of political will. So we wanted to bring together lots of NGOs to get the government to commit to this standard, which was going to mean good ecological status in all of our water bodies by 2015, and we thought this would be brilliant, and we've made no progress in that period of time. I mean, that's not strictly true. Certain elements, as Helen will say, have improved, but the overall good ecological, the meeting of the standard, which if you're a fish, you kind of need all of your elements in place. You need quality, quantity and habitat and all the different features of that. So I'd love to see good ecological status on all of our rivers, and we're now meant to get 75% of them there by 2027, and we are going to fail. We're about 15% at the moment. So
I hear a challenge that is good ecological status, a sort of snappy, publicly motivating. Yes. You know, but returning the salmon to the Rhine. We had returning the salmon to the Thames, didn't we?
Yes.
Many years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I have been a salmon fisherman. I don't fish for salmon in this country anymore because I think we should leave them alone. But because there aren't enough of them, and I would love to see salmon back in all of our rivers.
I suppose the point is, should you look for something a little bit more kind of visual or descriptive in ways that people will go, yes, I want that too. Whereas good ecological status, much as it's a important, desperately important thing, doesn't resonate with people who are not in the system. So I'm challenging you a bit on the...
Well, I mean, you could look at it from another perspective, which is rivers fit to swim in, which is extremely challenging, as Helen will say, because you've got a combination of agricultural pollution and sewage effluent. But I mean, that was certainly something we launched about 5 or 6 years ago as a standard, and having lots of swimmable rivers. We have, hardly any river bathing waters in France. There are hundreds.
Helen.
It's a really good question. It's a sort of big idea, isn't it? It's something iconic, and it did used to be the Thames. So I'm thinking back earlier into my career, the Thames was the global exemplar of an urban river that had been cleaned up. And we used to get visitors from all around the world saying, oh, we're going to do this for our river. And they couldn't. And actually, the Thames is at a huge advantage in that the principal influence on water quality in the Thames has always been wastewater. It didn't have some of the industrial inputs as other rivers, and we kind of lost that. And I don't think good ecological status is the answer. And you'll hear me talk about, I don't mind it as a concept, but you'll hear me to always talk about clean and plentiful because it's actually meaningful for people. So I think there's something around clean and plentiful, and there has been progress on our water quality. the issue with good ecological status is that it's all or nothing. Everything has to be right to achieve it, and that masks the progress that you can make. And I think, so I talked earlier about having one vision, and I'm not even going to say what I think it is, because I think it needs to be co-created. I think it's an ask and a discuss, not a tell. But then I think you need some milestones on the way which enable you to demonstrate some progress, and some of them might be more swimmable rivers. I think some of them might be making some of the stories we tell about nature and fish a bit more accessible to people, because I think it's a bit niche at the moment. Is it fish loving is a bit related to angling rather than to everybody. I don't think we tell the story about our iconic species in freshwater in particular. So I don't think it's one thing. I think there's a vision that has got a lot of facets to it. And also, I'll go back to where Mark started, it's got to be local. It's all very well talking about a river over there that's brilliant, but actually what people really want is that local environment to be in good shape. And I think we need to make a bit more of that.
Yeah, and I think local communities should set their vision for rivers. I think some of the clunkiness around our regulation at the moment can be, that you can have the sort of same standard for, channels which are actually just conveying sewage from sort of one treatment works to another part of a treatment works, and you can get some clunky regulation around that. So I think you've got to get a local community to say, this is what we want to achieve for our local river, and how do we best go about that, bringing everyone together. It's everyone's problem, and everyone can be part of the solution.
Brilliant. Now Matt's here, and then I've got a couple more lined up, so catch my eye if you want.
Hi everyone, Matt Greenfield from Wessex Water. I was really taken by both of your approaches at the start, and actually one of the things that, if I kind of paraphrase it a bit, is that the regulation is quite fragmented across different sectors. So we talk about agriculture and house building and water companies, etc. It's really fragmented, and ends up being quite output focused and prescriptive, and doesn't think about the system as a whole. And one of the things we've been talking about a lot, and we're really passionate about trying to fix this, is about how if you set the right targets at the top level and end up measuring and monitoring and incentivizing all the people who are kind of contributing to the issues properly, then the bit in the middle is about how you find the most efficient set of outcomes, the most efficient set of ways to deliver that improvement. And Mark, you said about spending each penny as wisely as you can. One of the things that we started a long time ago was a kind of solution in Poole Harbour, where we, rather than building a £40 million treatment works that was going to be very carbon intensive and not good for the environment, would have taken a lot of nitrates out of Poole Harbour, was actually to work with farmers and pay farmers at 70% less than it would have cost to build the treatment works, to plant cover crops over the off seasons that actually sucked up the nitrates and took more nitrates out of Poole Harbour than would have done by the treatment works. And that kind of catchment nutrient balancing is something that we've done a lot of, and I think is a really powerful way of finding the most efficient way to spend that pound.
And your question is?
And the question is, we're a bit worried that we might lose the ability to do that. And I guess a question for both of you, but for Helen as well. Can we is it safe to assume that's going to carry on?
Helen?
It's a very specific question, because we've been running catchment nutrient balancing as a trial for a number of years, and it's essentially an offsetting process where another sector, which is usually agriculture, takes some measures to reduce nutrient pollution, which means that you don't have to invest at sewage works. So we're in the process of making that decision at the moment, and we're not there yet. So you're asking the question. I know you're asking the question at a time when we haven't made the decision. I think there's a number of challenges around offsetting, and I would say the principal one for me is that if you use Mark's figures, which are the Environment Agency figures for good ecological status, 14%. If we're going to achieve the nutrient reductions that we need to achieve to get our water clean, the water industry needs to do everything that it can conceivably do to get its nutrients down, and the farming industry needs to do everything it can conceivably do to get its nutrients down. unless they both do it, we won't get there. So I think offsetting is an attractive idea because you can sort of play around with the cost, but actually if where you're trying to achieve is this, what you're doing is playing one sector off against another, you never get there. And it's a subject for lively debate, and me and Mark have debated it, and you've heard me and Mark agreeing vigorously on almost everything, and we don't agree on this. But I think the urgency of doing everything we can to achieve clean water means that we need to do everything. And I think there's also a bit of a clouding of the issue we've talked about, and we do agree there isn't enough money in the system. It sort of clouds that issue about how do we get to a situation where farming can properly invest in sustainable practices, and this sort of catchment nutrient balancing route probably isn't it. There's not enough of it, and there's not enough measures for farmers to do. So I think it's interesting. It's been an interesting trial over the last few years, and we're learning a lot more about what is and isn't possible. My view is, and we're still doing some work on this, that focusing on nature-based solutions that properly deliver for the catchment are a better way to go and a more productive way to go for nature and water.
Do you want to give us an insight into the arguments you're having about it?
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, we do everything everywhere all at once. But we're not in an ideal world, and there isn't money awash here. And it feels to me that you could make modest improvements to the sewage treatment works, but then if you can spend that money for much greater effect and take a lot more phosphate out in the catchment, then that, and with other benefits for flood and water resources and nature, then that makes a lot of sense to me. And I mean, there's a really perverse thing that came in the Environment Act where there are targets set for the water industry to reduce phosphates by 80% and agriculture by 40%. Now, the water industry, as we've heard, has already taken a lot of phosphate out, and is now going to have to take 80% out, and that's going to get increasingly expensive. Whereas agriculture, no one's actually really monitoring that or enforcing it, and it's unclear where the money's going to come from for them to do it. So in order to kind of, I wouldn't have gone down that route, because in catchments where 90% of the problem is agriculture, it doesn't make any sense. And it also leads to some perverse incentives for water industry to take out a lot of phosphate from the biggest works, which are at the bottom of rivers. And actually, if you can take the phosphate out at the top of the river, you get a bigger ecological gain. So, there are some nonsense things like that going on, and as I said, I think we need to take a systems approach and spend money where it's most cost effective to do that. And I think catchment nutrient balancing is a really useful tool for doing that. But we will agree to differ.
Yeah,
we won't fight.
There'll be limited value in going deeper into that one, but I think it just reinforces the point that you've both been making, is that we've just got to have an integrated approach and line things up. And when you've got to play people off against each other, because the system is so unjoined up and so inefficient, you have these kind of debates. But actually, if you reset the dial and everything,
and it's interesting that me and Zoe met Sir John Cunliffe at the same time, didn't we, Zoe? He's very astute. He does understand the arguments, having come into it knowing nothing about the water sector.
Let's get some more. There's one here.
There's one here. He's got the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
He's not letting go of it.
Make them brief. We've got lots.
Okay, very quickly. My name is also Matt, and I also work for Wessex Water. It's a bit spooky. Just to follow up the vet's question or point about education, we find that so true, is that people just don't understand how sewage treatment works work and what they do and what they don't do. And by the way, if anyone wants to come around Saltford Water Recycling Centre, we'll be opening it up soon. Come and see me, and I'll give you the details of when that will be. My question, however, is this. How concerned are environmental regulators and ENGOs that the carbon impact of the way in which water companies are going to be addressing storm overflows will have a wider environmental impact than the water quality issues they're meant to be addressing?
perversity again, I think. Yes, Matt.
Yeah, I'm not called Matt as well. Yes, I am very concerned about that. And basically, if you just build an enormous storm tank to store sewage and a lot of rainwater, you're only achieving one objective, which is to store that sewage for a bit and then hopefully treat it. But those tanks are enormous and they fill up really quickly. But by taking a catchment-based approach and looking upstream and slowing the amount of water that's going into the catchment, you can achieve countless other objectives at the same time. So you can green cities, you can reduce the fear of crime, you can cool our overheated streets, you can provide a home for nature, you can sequester carbon rather than emit it. And it's just sort of, why wouldn't you do that? Something with multiple benefits, and that makes our world a much better place. No one sees a storm tank and goes, "Oh, great, a new resource for our community." It's, you know, they're really ugly, and they emit huge amounts of carbon. And the overall approach to water is that you should manage it where the raindrop falls, and every step further downstream gets more expensive. So start when it lands and with healthy soils, and then work down from that to store it and hold it back in every possible opportunity.
And just to be a bit perverse, I mean, it was the public outcry around this has led to the government insisting that they're all dealt with, even if some of them, you know, were not as big a problem as others. And so, in a way, you can get public outcry through less informed debate that guides us in may not be the most sustainable direction. So, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm all in favour of rainfall management. We were in this conversation in the taxi, weren't we? I think where we've landed in terms of what we need to do for storm overflows is where it is. Anything we can do to innovate to reduce carbon impact, I think, is right. A bit of shout. It's interesting. It's sort of shout out for big tanks. I think they're not ever always going to be the best solution. In some places they are, and if you look at some of the debate in Europe around how they manage water quality in urban areas in Amsterdam, Paris and whatever, for urban swimming, for example, those big schemes are designed to have big tanks which will handle water, which are sort of belt and braces. So they do have their place, but I am far more in the looking ahead, and some of the investigations that are going on through this AMP cycle ought to be about how can we be more innovative, how we can get water out of these networks in the first place.
Great question. Now, this gentleman here, and then there's one here. And then
A couple of questions then. One is that I'm a member of Farleigh District Swimming Club, and we're a designated bathing water site. And part of the reason we went for this was to put pressure on the EA and on Wessex Water. Wessex Water have been great. They're testing our water regularly for us. EA, obviously, now, under the designated regime, are doing so as well. But I think we need to know, really, we need a catchment group of some kind, because, you know, at our bit of the river, we're concerned about the bacteria levels. Upstream at Frome, there's a big Friends of River Frome organisation, and they're interested in the ecological status of the river. So we do have different demands. So we do need to look at it at a catchment level of the Frome. And how do we do that? How do we even start is the question. How do we get that going? The other question is about impoundment. One of the reasons there is a swimming club at Farleigh is because we have a weir and impounds the water. I mean, as far as I was concerned, in upland area, or not uplands, in the upper parts of catchments, weirs can be quite a good thing because the water, the soil settles behind them, the silt settles behind them, takes the phosphates down to the ground. And I'm slightly confused then. An impoundment, I think, is not necessarily a bad thing. Certainly when water goes over our weir, a lot of oxygen gets into it.
Okay, so outdoor swimming, catchments, weirs, good or bad?
I would say weirs really are terrible for rivers. They prevent the movement downstream of gravels, which are really, really important for the whole ecological function of the river. You know, those phosphates aren't lost, they're still stored in those sediments and they build up over time. And as I said, you lose that kind of natural pool-riffle sequence. And personally, I mean, I love river swimming. I'd much rather swim in a deep pool between sparkling riffles and knowing that the water was cleaner as a result than if it's all ponded up behind a weir. And if you're a fish, weirs are awful because all fish migrate up and down rivers in their lifetime. Obviously, salmon and sea trout and eels and things are famous for it, but all fish move around, and weirs make it really difficult for them to do so. Fish passes are rarely effective and only at certain types of flow, and that tends to be when they get picked off by cormorants and goosanders and herons and things, is when they're trying to get over that lip. And I've seen minnows trying to jump over a weir this big, which is a EA gauging weir actually, and minnows trying to jump over, and a heron just eating these minnows as they were on a little mini migration of their own. So if it was down to me, I'd blow them all up.
Right.
But
I'm going to get Helen to answer the catchment bit, because I want to get some more
but I mean, Mark, so how do you set up a catchment group? Where do you start?
I mean, there are catchment partnerships all over the country, and so find your local catchment partnership, and please do go along.
Ask this Matt here, I'm sure.
Yes, yeah, Matt will tell you about the ones that are locally, which are.
But just on it, Farley Hungerford is an absolutely fabulous place to swim. Absolutely lovely.
Okay, good. You heard it here first. There was a question, a man in the green.
I think Helen's answered my question, so I'll
okay. This gentleman here, thank you. Great, thanks, Amy. Please say who you are.
Yeah, Richard Mann. I'm Climate and Nature Group Lead for Winsley Parish Council, and I'm doing some community stuff. There's a few people in the audience today. We've got a Wild Waters Festival coming the first 2 weeks of June, so I'm helping facilitate a dozen communities between Bradford on Avon and Bath East and Box and Culloden have joined us. Climate and nature focused engagement of local people on the river themed issues. I hear everything. I'd love to see rewilded rivers and water in community ownership and all the rest of it, but that's by the by for now because that's not so easy to get to. But isn't the River Wise situation a bit simpler? Surely it was one of the most spectacularly beautiful rivers that England ever had, and it seems to be pollution from chicken farms, as far as I understand it. Why can't we solve that?
So,
yeah.
I mean, that was really a spectacular failure of planning policy, in that the local authority at the top of the Y decided to have a diversification policy for farms. So they encourage farms to build chicken sheds right at the top of a catchment, where lorries full of chicken food have to be driven up the narrow roads of the Upper Wye Valley to feed to chickens, and them producing vast amounts of waste, which was going into some of the most sensitive headwaters of a special area of conservation. And so the local planning authorities just waved these things through. If they had, I think it was less than 40,000 birds each, they weren't subject to regulation. So they, and you know, the land, you know, if the chickens are free range, then the land where they peck around becomes incredibly puddled, and all the manure goes into the river. And if they're just trying to get rid of the waste, it's too heavy to drive all the way down again, so they just spread it on the fields as a waste product. And you've had this enormous build-up of phosphorus and nitrogen. And it's a disaster. And again, it's that lack of joined-upness that the local authority had no responsibility for ensuring that the river wasn't polluted.
Can they get joined up anytime soon?
Well, that's what we're hoping from the Cunliffe Commission, is that will happen, and that you will have decisions like that being taken as part of the land use framework and as part of an integrated water plan, that local authorities will be sitting alongside the Environment Agency and Natural England saying, you know, this isn't a good idea.
Could the EA have intervened earlier on the Wye? I mean, it's such a, I mean, it's
Well,
such
so
yeah,
from a
tell us
planning
about
perspective, no, because
Yeah.
we wouldn't be
Wouldn't be
a
asked.
statutory
Yeah.
consultee for planning. As Mark says, the way the regulations work is if you have under 40,000 birds, it's not regulated, and for sites with over 40,000 birds, the regulation is for the building, not for the manure. So where there are farming rules for water, for whatever farmers are supposed to do things properly, there's still more manure hitting the ground than there should be. And actually, if you look at now, nutrient inputs into the Y have come down quite substantially, but they haven't from the lug. And so there's something going on in the lug, which is a saturation of these nutrients, which, I mean, your question is it going to be fixed anytime soon? The answer is there'll be things that can be done to prevent new inputs, but that saturation of nutrients will be sitting there for a long time. And when we look at the land use framework, we end up then with some quite difficult choices, because what the choices might be if we really want to make a difference to water quality on the lug, for example, is a complete change of land use, so trees, not agriculture. And once we start having those conversations, they're a lot stickier, because they're not about something on low-grade land peripheral to a farming activity. They're a complete change of land use.
So right on the England-Wales border.
Really, isn't it? We've treated it as last, it's been on the main as last.
But it's not really hand-wringing, is it? Because it's about what needs to be done is quite fundamental. And so it's almost the opposite of hand-wringing. How are we going to have that conversation about fundamental? I used to work with a colleague who was very interested in nitrates back in the 1990s, and his position was that we needed to plant trees everywhere from the Wash to the Severn. Everywhere south of that need to be trees if we were going to reach the clean and plentiful from a perspective of nitrogen. So, we need a much bigger conversation about what we want to do.
Now, have we got any students in the room? Or, yes, I'm going to encourage... have you got a question? Do you want a question? Don't feel you have to. Yes, let's hear from you. Tell us what you're studying.
Hi, I'm Aria. I'm studying a degree in chemistry, so I'm going to focus this more on chemistry. When I'm in the labs, we have very strict procedures on what to do with chemical waste. And for a lot of things, that involves putting them in completely separate waste bins, and then it gets taken off to be processed. But for some chemicals, you mentioned dilution is the solution. The official policy is dilute down the sink. What do you think is kind of a good thing to do with chemical waste from that point of view? You've also mentioned paint strippers and similar chemicals. The chemicals that we all go, I'll just put it down the sink and with a bit of water and it'll be fine.
Helen,
Right. Okay, well, I think, some of our colleagues from Wessex Water might have a view about this one. Our advice would not to be putting any chemicals down the sink and to dispose of at local authority facilities, which kind of doesn't work for a university facility. I'd be very surprised if the advice was to wash anything down the sink. Although, of course, we do that at home, don't we? We use bleaches and disinfectants and detergents, and a small amount in a very large amount of sewage. I'm looking at the people who are the experts, is kind of okay, but at sort of commercial use of chemicals, they should not be going down the drain without a conversation with your local water company.
No, so the same, yeah.
I think there's a question right at the back there, yes.
Hello. So kind of where to... Oh, sorry. So I'm Gemma. I wear two hats. So work for Baines Council as a water space project officer, but also live in the River Froome. Or I don't live in the river. live in Froome, the Somerset Froome, and I'm involved with a family group. So Froome Families for the Future, and we've been doing a River Vision project for the past year, and mainly focused on engagement with the public, to get them excited about the river again, engaged with the river, spending time by the river, just wanting to care for it. And we've done a whole host of things already of what you've suggested the community can do to help. We've been trying to raise awareness about tips and stuff they can do in the household, their daily life, lots of different things. And we've also done a River Froome water cycle, hoping to do a River Avon water cycle. Watch this space. But yeah, just trying to communicate that. But our next step for this year is working with landowners, but we're not agricultural experts, if you like. So one thing that's been suggested from some experts we've been talking and working with is basically making resources for farmers a lot more accessible. And I just wondered, I guess, from your experience, if you know if resources to help farmers understand and access to make change on their land, is that information already readily available and easy and quick for them to access? Or would some kind of really accessible and simplified handbook, guidance, something that comes from a different angle? Like you said, we did come in a bit late, but I think you were saying like kind of campaigning and like education coming from different angles. We'd be coming at it from like a family angle, like our children want to swim in the river. We'd be coming at it from that angle for future generations, rather than an expert in the field, if that makes sense. So I'm just wondering if the resources are already there and we shouldn't put our time and energy into it.
I don't think they are in that form. There is a bit of a mess with farm advice in that there are lots of people doing it. I mean, we have in the Rivers Trust movement about 100 farm advisors, and you know, they're trained to a certain standard, and they give a lot of farm advice with thousands of farmers every year. But there are lots of other people giving advice, and it doesn't always match up. So farmers are kind of getting bombarded with often contradictory advice. So I think it's actually a really, really good suggestion to provide something which is kind of entry level, which could pique their interest. But I think my advice to you would be, you know, do go and talk to your local Rivers Trust, probably Bristol Avon Rivers Trust. Yeah. They have a lot of farm advisors, and they will be able to let you know kind of what's going on, what you could build on, and I'm sure they'll be able to give you information. If not, do get in touch with us, and I'll put you in touch with our farming experts.
And you do a certain amount of farm advice too, don't you?
We do regulation, which is advice-led, so you can look at what the Environment Agency does. You could also look at the collaboration we have with Natural England, which is catchment-sensitive farming, who also give advice and have quite a lot of material, so they're worth looking at. But I'm also taken by your angle. I think what does it matter to me, the family angle is really powerful and increasingly so.
Sorry, can I just pick up on one other point you made, which was also excellent, I think, which is that if a local community, if those conversations are happening in the local community, you can often get really good action. So we did a natural flood management project in the northwest of England, and we had people from the local community going and talking one-to-one to farmers and saying, look, we need to store this many thousands of millions of gallons of water on the land. Where would we be best doing that? And because they had a trusted relationship and they knew that it was going to benefit the community downstream, and the community were involved in that, they became really enthusiastic about it and really cooperative, and in fact were volunteering on each other's farms, which doesn't happen very often, to sort of go and plant hedges and build bunds and things to hold the water back. So you know, farmers are constantly having stuff done to them, and if it can be done with them in collaboration, then they're much more likely to be on side.
Yeah. And the farmers are feeling particularly done to at the moment with the closure of the SFI this week as well. I mean, there's just so much going on, but I think a lot of what you're saying is about really local relationships. I think that's very strong. Somebody just put their hand up. Anyone? Yes, one at the back here and then here. Yeah, Amy's running. She's going to get very fit today. Thank you.
I'm Tomo. I'm also Wessex Water as a catchment scientist. Can I just ask your opinion on what you think of continuous water quality monitoring? So Environment Act Section 81, to monitor upstream. 82, yes, sorry, you are right. 82. To measure upstream and downstream of water company assets. do you think it's a good use of taxpayers' money? Is there a plan in place on how we're actually going to use that data? And how can we really leverage the value of that data?
Do you want to go first, or shall I?
You go first, Martin.
The answer to your question is no. I don't think it's a good use of money. I think it's going to be about, well, I've heard estimates as much as 4 or 5 billion that water companies are going to have to spend on monitoring upstream and downstream of every combined sewer overflow. And because, as you know, I'm now telling you things you know, but combined sewer overflows tend to be concentrated in particular areas. So we're going to know an enormous amount about some short stretches of river, and then we're going to know very little about the vast majority of rivers. So if you want to take a catchment approach, it would be not how you would do it. And I can see why that was put in place. It was a knee-jerk reaction to the pressure that was on the government from campaigners around sewage overflows, and it sort of seems a logical thing to do, but when you actually look at the practicalities, it's incredibly expensive and carbon intensive and complicated, and they're going to require a whole load of maintenance. So a given 4 to 5 billion pounds on that, and then the Environment Agency's monitoring budget is certainly less than 100 million, like 70 million. It just doesn't make any sense at all to do that.
Helen, do you agree?
If we had a blank sheet of paper, would we start there? No, we wouldn't. But the other part of your question is, are we working on how we use it? Yes, we are. So we're talking to Ofwat about how we use it. I agree with Mark, and actually it's a feature of a reduced monitoring programme that we tend already to focus on monitoring around places where we know we'll find a problem. There's no point in monitoring where we think things are fine and they aren't changing. So I think there is an issue there. The one thing in its favour is that, having done a couple of conferences recently, there's an awful lot of innovation going on around continuous monitoring, which I think will be of use elsewhere as well.
Good. Question here.
Hello, I'm Richard Greenhouse. I'm Chief of Staff at the Office for Environmental Protection, and we've been hearing about the good ecological status target being put back, due in 2027. It's quite clear it's not going to be met. My organisation in part exists to hold government to account for meeting a target which is not now going to be met, as seems to be widely acknowledged. Should that matter, what is the role of statutory targets in this sphere?
Gosh, that's a big question, very big. Great question.
How long have we got?
Great question, go on.
I think it does matter. I think as somebody who's a regulator and has been involved in water for an awful long time, I was there, as some other people in the room were, when the Water Framework Directive was introduced, and it was, at the time it was called the English Directive, and everybody else in Europe was grumbling about having to do everything the way that the UK did it, all this dreadful catchment management stuff. And we went through an awful long period. Well, I'll say two things. One, in putting the Water Framework Directive together, the way it was constructed, which is one out all out, you can't demonstrate any progress unless everything is right, was not particularly well overseen at the time by the Commission. So that came about really without what I would say was proper scrutiny, and I don't think the consequences of that were thought through. So I think there could have been a better design. And I think very interesting conversations within the European community, which is governments talking to each other and all nodding and smiling and saying, yes, we are going to be able to, 2027, that's what we're heading for. And the practitioners in arm's length bodies or whatever like ours saying, not sure how we're going to get there. So I think there's been a long history across Europe of not really coming to terms with the fact that what we were trying to achieve within the period was achievable. I also think that there's a risk when you set a target which is a long way off, that you kick a can down the road. So 2027 date has been iconic. It should have been 2015, but everybody was like, oh, well, we can get an extension, so we won't worry about 2015. 2027 is a really long way away. Not now. No. And it's interesting hearing people talking in and around Cunliffe about extending the planning horizon and the investment horizon for water from maybe 5 years to a 25-year plan. It's kind of okay, but if you say that's a long way away, we'll worry about that in 5 years down the road. Yeah. And so I think there's real challenges with the way the Water Framework Directive was constructed. But back to your point, does it matter? Having an apex target really matters. Being clear about where you're trying to get to really matters, which is why, in the context of what we might do next, that having a vision, where are we all trying to get to? Are we looking each other in the eye? Are we shaking each other's hands and saying this is what we're trying to achieve? Is hugely important and hugely powerful. But I think we can learn from what has not gone well with the Water Framework Directive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does matter. I think the Water Framework Directive isn't the problem. I'm actually quoting the OEP back to you, I think, which is that the regulations are sound. It's been the implementation. And I think the reason the implementation has been bad is that the political will wasn't there to take the really tough decisions that were required in order to meet these standards. So there was a huge over-reliance in the early plans on derogation. So the sort of reasons for not doing things were found in sort of industrial scale for sort of like disproportionately expensive or cause unknown. But no efforts were found to sort of find what the cause was. And a lot of the measures that were put in were generic, so they were the same thing was written, but there was no delivery plan for making that happen. So a lot of work went into writing plans, which you wouldn't really call plans. They were just sort of words on a piece of paper because they didn't actually lead to action being taken. So we could have made really significant progress. There are definitely some rivers which are going to be really, really challenging to get to that state because, as Helen says, they're kind of, got buildings all around them and, they're sort of, in concrete channels and that's really difficult. But we could have made much, much more substantial progress if we had the political will. And I think, this debate is kind of framed in a context in which our political system is inadequate for rising to the huge challenges that we face. I mean, we already see, major political parties backing off net zero in the last few days. We are not prepared to have a really honest conversation and say our way of life really has to change fundamentally if we're going to address these enormous environmental challenges. And we're just kicking the can further down the road and making it much more expensive for our children to deal with the problems eventually. And they're going to get worse and worse. And I think the only thing that's going to change is when it gets so terrible that there is no choice. We're very good at responding to crises, but we're really poor at responding to something which is quite obviously a crisis, but it isn't actually here yet. And so we'll say, well, when it gets here, we'll definitely do something about it.
And good for the OEP, actually. I think we've seen now a series of reports which are starting to build up an evidence base, which is really helpful. Yeah. Now, I think we're drawing to a close, but I've just got one question which you might be able to answer in a word, you might not. But, because we've missed talking ourselves into the gloom here, whereas we started off saying, no, this is the best opportunity ever, and which I still believe it is, and I still know that you believe it is. So, if you look globally, who does it? Who does this well? And can we emulate some good practice elsewhere in the world? Or are we so uniquely awful and problematic? Is there anywhere else?
We're certainly not unique. And I don't think any country does it brilliantly. Mm-hmm. Some countries do it better. Mm-hmm. So Denmark, in some respects, does it better. Netherlands does it better. Yeah. But Netherlands has got... The thing that's different about the Netherlands is they've got land use and management in quite robust control.
Bring on the land use.
Because they have to, because so much of the land is underwater. That kind of understanding that what you do with your own land might actually be of interest to government, they've got and we don't. So there are places doing it better, but for a reason.
I mean, I'd add Australia to that list, and also South Africa. You know, they faced a real crisis with Cape Town getting to really nearly running out of water. And so they have taken a really much more fundamental look in certain parts. I mean, you're absolutely right. Every country is wrestling with the same problem, and you know, I sometimes wonder whether our democracies are capable of responding with the vigour that we need to, as I just said. But you know, I was at the World Water Week in Stockholm last year, and was just making tea, and there was a woman from Lesotho next to me who was talking about the need to control sediment runoff from agriculture, and that was the biggest problem that they were wrestling with, because it was filling up a reservoir with sediment and reducing the lifespan of the reservoir.
But there are some big watershed examples in the States, actually, not the whole of the States, but some very
no, there's some,
well, you know, and that's kind of integrated catchment approaches. I'm sure we're going to get an answer from Jan. Come on, tell us the answer.
Yeah, just while the mic's going to him, I met a woman in America who loved watersheds so much, which is what they call catchments over there. She changed the number plate on her car to H2O shed.
Well, I quite like some of those watersheds.
No, what I just wanted to say about having political will, and actually what it all comes to is also a sense of urgency, I think, with politicians. But what I see now currently in Europe is that we have, since we have a new European Commission in last year, we have now a European Commissioner who is responsible for water resilience and circular economy. And I think there's a big trend going on to invest in water, to become really resilient in water, just because we need to have it. We need to become independent. If you look at what is happening around us in a geopolitical sense, but also if we want to go for new things like renewable energies use a lot of water. If we go to hydrogen, we use enormous amount of clean water. So there is really a need for water, just more than just ecological status. There is really a demand for water, and I think for agriculture, well, we always say they are polluting, but agriculture also needs clean water, and I think there's much more broader discussion needed for this.
We all do.
So does AI and gaming.
So does AI and gaming. Now, before we talk ourselves into another corner, could I just say thank you very, very much. Great questions, great ideas and engagement, and some very positive ideas, as well as the feeling of blimey, there's a lot to do here. So thanks very, very much for coming. But a big, big thank you to Mark and Helen, who've been absolutely brilliant and very honest. And, you know, I think I certainly feel a great sense of confidence. With people like you in charge, we're going to get somewhere, despite all the difficulties. We are definitely going to make progress. So well done, everybody.
Thank you, Fiona.